This week we're getting into some practical tips that should help you when you're doing sound design for your films. Hello, my name is Simon Cade and this is DSLRguide. So in this next instalment of my series on sound design, we're getting into the nuts and bolts of sound design, getting a little bit technical and just going over some of the tools that filmmakers can use when they're working with sound. So the first thing is EQ. So it's really important that you understand that sound is made up of different frequencies. So for instance, you have low frequency sounds like a bass line, which is also very low in pitch. Then you have a mid-range sound like maybe vocals, and then you have high frequency, high pitch sounds like hi-hats. So with any sound, we can boost the low frequencies to make it sound more bassy, or we could cut the mids to thin it out a little bit, or we could boost the high frequencies to make it sound brighter or more crisp. It's all very similar to adjusting the shadows, midtones, and highlights with a curves tool. So when you're mixing your sound, combining dialogue with sound effects and music, it's definitely worth thinking about the frequencies of the different sounds, because if your music is very similar in pitch to your dialogue, then it can be very difficult to distinguish between the two. So I recommend that you find the EQ controls in your video editor and try boosting and cutting different frequencies to see what it sounds like. And you can use the analyzer to see which frequencies are most prominent in each sound and then give them space. So by this I just mean that you can, for example, look at your vocals and see which frequencies they are most prominent in, and then you can go over to your music and reduce those frequencies a little bit. So that means that your music can still be nice and loud, but it won't be fighting with the dialogue. Now the next tip is just to record lots of sounds. So on set you'll be focusing on the dialogue, but then later on in post you have to go back and record clothing sounds and footsteps and anything else that the characters are interacting with. And then also you want to think about ambience. You know, should there be birds tweeting in the background? That can make it sound very happy and lifelike. Or maybe you're near a train station, so you want there to be a really loud kind of train station sound in the background. But the point is, most people don't even get to this stage. They don't even think about recording each individual sound. Whereas if you watch any proper movie or any TV show, you'll see that even in things like nature documentaries, they actually go back and add in every single sound in post, and they spend a lot of time making sure it's good. So if you want some more inspiration about that, I did do a video about recreating the sounds from Shaun of the Dead, so there's a link on the blog post if you're interested. So next up is panning. Now, if you listen to almost any song, you'll notice that the vocals sound very centered, which means they're coming out of both speakers equally. Whereas things like the backing vocals or maybe violins or cymbals often sound like they're coming from either the left or the right, and this is done through making it come out of one speaker louder than the other one. So in filmmaking, there are two main uses for panning, and the first one is to give the audience an idea of the direction and the placement of things. So for instance, in my intro, we had some things on the table and I decided to pan the objects on the left. I decided to pan them to the left and vice versa with the stuff on the right. And I guess this just makes it a bit more realistic because it makes sense that things from the left sound like they're coming from the left. But the other way we can use it is in terms of separation. So if you've got lots of sound effects and lots of really loud music, it can often get too muddy where you can kind of just, there's a mess and you can't really hear what's going on. So often things that are similar frequencies will often be panned oppositely. So let's say that you have some shakers and then you have a tambourine in your music. Well, because those two are very similar frequencies, they're both quite high-pitched sounds, you could pan those off, one a bit to the left and the other one a bit to the right, and that would help make it a lot easier to pick out those different sounds. So we don't have similar sounds coming from exactly the same place. Now the next thing is reverb. So reverb is basically just the kind of natural echoes and sound reflections that you get in any room. So if I add some reverb to my voice now, you can hear that it kind of sounds like I'm standing in a big room, maybe a cathedral. But the way that I usually end up using reverb is just, so let's say I've recorded some footsteps, which I wanted to add to some footage. Well, if you record them in a very quiet environment, it can often sound too sterile. It can sound like they've been recorded in a studio, and just adding some reverb kind of takes the edge off and makes it sound like they're actually in the scene. So let's just quickly backtrack to when you're actually recording the sounds. Now, I'm assuming that most of you know the basics, which is just to use an external microphone and get it nice and close to the source. But after that, I think the most important thing is just to find a quiet location. So this pretty much means if you are trying to film somewhere that has got a construction site nearby, or it's right by a train track, then obviously you're going to have some issues with getting a clean sound. So it pretty much is just a case of turning up at wherever you're going to be filming, maybe a couple of days early, and just having a listen and seeing whether there are any noise problems, because even with the best equipment, it will be really difficult to get clean sound in a noisy environment. So I think when you're choosing locations, audio has got to be just as important as the visuals. So even if somewhere looks amazing, if it's too noisy, then you really have to think carefully about whether you want to move the shoot to anywhere else. Now, this next tip I heard on Music Radio Creative, and I'll embed their video on the blog post because I think it's really worth watching. But the kind of general idea of it is that if you are recording some dialogue and then when you come to edit it, you see that someone has made a mistake and then ended up repeating the line, then rather than cutting at the end of a sentence and then cutting to the new sentence, it's a lot better to actually cut in the middle of a word, which is something which I definitely haven't been doing naturally, but I've been trying it out for these episodes, and I have to say it works really well. So the idea is that you zoom in really close and you find the exact point in the middle of a word, and then you match up with the new clip that hasn't got the mistake, and then you cut it right there, and for some reason it just sounds really clean and it doesn't sound strange like it does at the end of a sentence. Now, using the right music is such an important decision, and it can pretty much make or break any film. And if you're like me, then you don't have the money to hire someone to be a custom score composer for your films. So what I do is I have a playlist on Spotify, which basically just has a really wide range of songs from all kinds of genres. And then what I'll do is I'll find a rough cut of the video I'm working on, and I'll play it with all of my different songs, and just to see whether a high energy song works, or what kind of genre, folk music or electronic music. There's all kinds of different stuff, and I just try everything, and I find every single time that it's really useful for me to know about the tempo, the style, and even some things about the timing. Just by playing it with random songs, it's such a useful thing to do. So I highly recommend you do that. I'll put a link on the blog post to my playlist, but it's always worth reminding yourself as you're listening that it's not about whether the song sounds good, it's about whether it fits with the film. And finally, if you want to improve your sound design skills, you should definitely try some of these things. So the first one is to make a cartoon or some sort of really simple animation, but then make sure you really put some time into the sound design, because this is a really useful experiment because you have nothing to start from. Animation is totally silent. For sound design inspiration, I highly recommend that you just watch Star Wars, because there are so many iconic sound effects in that franchise. And then also I recommend that you make your own playlist, which has a nice variety of songs of all kinds of genres, so that you can do what I do, which is to play music while you're editing and do over rough cuts, so that you can make a really good decision about the kind of style for your music. And the final thing is that on the blog post I'll also link to some other videos that I've made about sound design, and if you're interested then check it out. There's quite a few actually on there, and of course I'll also embed some videos which have taught me lots about sound design. So that's it for this week, and I'll see you next time.